Also joining us is Dr. Heather Hall. Dr. Hall is joining us by Zoom from Guelph. She's an assistant professor and the director of the Economic Development and Innovation Program at the University of Waterloo. So welcome to Mr. Wells, to Dr. Greenwood, and virtually to Dr. Hall. So, Rob, if you'd like to start, you have the floor.
Okay, I'm going to add a little more to the historical context, although the more contemporary period that I lived through. I can't thank Clyde Wells enough for his leadership on this issue and this presentation today. I think the presentation itself, because of who you are, is a real watershed in thinking about this for our province. Most of my professional life has revolved around this issue. It was the inspiration for my PhD, and in fact, it goes back, as we were chatting earlier, I wrote speeches for Brian Peckford. I was 12. I was quite young, not quite that young. And that's significant because the annual speech to the NLFM at the time, Newfoundland Labrador Federation of Municipalities, now MNL, was the most important speech of the year for the Premier when I was there, and I think through many administrations. Because that was the collection of elected officials from all over the province. I remember the bear pit sessions. Ministers would fight to be at those sessions because it was a key session to be part of. I think in some subsequent governments that declined in importance. At the time when I was there, another key organization, in my view, with an interest in regional economic development was the NLRDC, the Newfoundland and Labrador Regional Development Council, Rural Development Council. And they were the network of, I think in the end, 59 rural development associations. Amazing volunteers, did amazing work for years, but didn't have the recourse to universal franchise that municipal government has. As weak as municipal government is relative to most places in Newfoundland, in Canada and the world, Western world, the Rural Development Associations were a voluntary bottom-up NGO doing great work, but didn't have the right to claim to speak for the people in the community. And so the Premier almost never went to the NLRDC conference. And that, as a young political scientist, historian, thinking about this stuff kind of sunk in for me. And so when the Royal Commission on Employment and Unemployment, Doug House was the chair, delivered his final report, Building on Our Strengths, the very last recommendation of that Royal Commission was to support municipalities to play a more active role in economic development, because up to that time they hadn't. And so and I had been a background researcher on the background paper on labor, so I felt a bit of connection to the Royal Commission. And then Clyde Wells, this gentleman here, asked Doug House to chair the Economic Recovery Commission to follow up on, in many ways, many of the recommendations of the Royal Commission. By then, I decided to do my PhD on all this stuff, comparing Newfoundland, Labrador, and Northern Norway. And the Nordic countries, in my view, are the adults on planet Earth in many respects. Unlike Canada and the US, they are not federal. There are no equivalents of provinces or states. They have a strong national government and they have strong local government. But local government, called communes, communa, are based on the original church parish areas, taking in 10, 15, 20 or more individual communities, a region, a local labor market area. They have real authority. They're often the largest employer in rural areas. They collect income tax. And they're not on Mars. They exist around the North Atlantic Rim. They look just like us. But their way of governing, and Mr. Wells' presentation captured it in the Canadian context, dramatically different in terms of decentralization of authority. So I wrote an article in the Telegram at the time, while doing my PhD, saying how we should learn from this in Newfoundland, Labrador. Rich Fuchs, do you remember Rich?
I do.
Worked closely with Doug at the ERC. Saw this and invited me to present to the ERC, and they invited Doug Smith, one of Craig's predecessors at NLFM, to attend. The NLFM then asked the ERC to convene a meeting with the Rural Development Council to explore how they could work together. NLFM didn't want to get on the turf of NLRDC, but they did see I like to think I had some influence on it, that municipalities and the powers they brought, the legitimacy they brought, they're a level of the state. They have ultimate recourse to the legitimate use of force in areas of their authority. Rural development associations don't have that. NGOs don't have that. And so I was hired as soon as I graduated, thank God, to work half-time ERC, half-time business school. John Wickham from Enterprise Newfoundland Labrador was assigned to work with me, to work with NLFM and the NLRDC on a process to explore how the two organizations and their members could collaborate in regional economic development. Then one day, Doug House told me the Premier, this gentleman, had drawn lines on the map and we should look at how they could guide regional planning and development. And I was quite perturbed that day. What the hell? What do you know about this? I'm the one who did the PhD. Well, you actually knew quite a lot. And you were quite clear. I remember the 17 zones you said were there as a start to get discussion going. They could change, but we need to be thinking regionally. And that led to the Task Force on Community Economic Development. And that was a massive exercise. It was federal, provincial. Doug House, the top economic development bureaucrat for the province, Gordon Slade, the top federal economic development bureaucrat, were co-chairs. NLFM was there, NLRDC was there, Community Futures, Women's Enterprise were all represented. And it was an extensive process. I was director of research and I was the pen reporting to the task force of the final report, Community Matters. Getting to the punchline here. In my first draft of the opening section, you would never have seen this. I talked about the absence and the need for regional government in Newfoundland Labrador. I still have it in my files. I don't throw anything out, as my staff will tell you. Doug read it, and Doug has been an amazing mentor and inspiration and thought leader on these issues for me and many. And Heather, I know, follows in that tradition. And Doug read it and crossed it out, where I was talking about the background on regional government, saying we're not ready yet. And he was probably right, because it was a big jump for municipalities to get involved in regional rural economic development. The legislation prohibited them at the time, even though many were doing it. My PhD had looked at all that. So we went with economic zones and REDBs, regional economic development boards, performance contracts, and all that. And it was incredibly innovative. We were ahead of the curve worldwide. I dined out on economic zones and REDBs, presented across Canada, in the States, in Europe, in Australia, for a decade. They all wanted to emulate what we had. And of course, it didn't last, as Mr. Wells.
And we abandoned it.
Yep. So I share Mr. Wells' disappointment. That's not even a strong enough word. In our subsequent government's failure to support the REDBs or to advance regional government. I think we're ready now. And that's where I'll end off for now.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. So Heather, Dr. Hall, we can throw to you if you're ready to go. We'd love to hear from you.
Perfect. Thanks, Craig. As Craig mentioned, I grew up in Northern Ontario, and much like Newfoundland and Labrador, it never had a regional government structure either. There are districts there which are different than the county system that's in Southern Ontario, and those districts are purely an administrative function for the provincial government and carry very little when it comes for economic development or decision making. Like Rob, I've spent most of my academic career looking at regional development. I did my PhD exploring the politics of regional economic development in Northern Ontario. And then I was really lucky to go to Newfoundland and Labrador as a postdoc for 2 years, working with Rob and Kelly Vodden, doing research on regional innovation as well as on the REDBs. And much like Honourable Wells, I believe regions matter. In fact, I think many of the pressing environmental, demographic, social, economic, and health realities that we are currently facing require us to think regionally when it comes to planning, economic development, and governance. Regions have a long history in our government policies, programs, and politics, and there are many successful regional approaches from across the country. When it comes to regional government, there are regional districts in British Columbia, counties in Southern Ontario, and MRCs in Quebec. Regional districts in British Columbia, for example, were created in the 1960s out of a need for greater regional cooperation and cost sharing between municipal areas and their surrounding rural communities. They often provide region-wide services such as regional parks and 911 services. They provide intermunicipal or sub-regional services such as recreation facilities, and they act as the local government for unincorporated areas. They can also create regional growth strategies to provide a regional lens to development. When we talk about economic development and innovation, the region is often seen as the ideal setting for innovation and learning to occur. Concepts like clusters, industrial districts, innovation systems, and the helixes all emphasize the importance of place and the region. Some examples in policy and practice include regional innovation centers in Ontario, which are provincially funded not-for-profit innovation centers that provide businesses and entrepreneurs with access to innovation and entrepreneurship-related programming, including business incubation services. Another example includes smart specialization strategies in the European Union, which are regional strategies to support innovation and R&D. They build on unique regional assets, engage stakeholders, are evidence-based with sound monitoring and evaluation systems, and focus policy support and investment on key regional priorities. And a third example are the regional enterprise networks in Nova Scotia, which offer a collaborative approach to economic development and support for businesses by building on the unique strengths and values of the regions they represent. There are many other examples from across the country, including regional service delivery agreements and regional accords, to friendship agreements between Indigenous communities and neighboring municipalities. Despite these examples, regional approaches are often deeply contested. So why do we love to hate regions? I think there are three reasons. First, regions are social constructs, meaning regions are not out there waiting to be discovered. We create regions to serve a purpose, whether that is political, economic, cultural, environmental, or administrative. As a result, creating regions or drawing boundaries often creates tensions over the purpose of those boundaries, who and what is included in those boundaries, and who has the power to decide. Second, we form strong attachments to our local communities, and our communities can be vital to our personal identities. When we talk about regions, we often fear losing all or part of our community and personal identities as a result. There are also long-standing political, personal, and more often than we care to admit, sports-related rivalries between communities that prevent them from wanting to work regionally. And finally, our local governments are also the unit of government that is closest to us, the people. And there's often fear that regional approaches will erode this local decision-making. However, when done right, regional approaches can strengthen local voices, support economic development, promote sustainability, and build resilience. So how do we get it right? There are 5 key resources that are needed to provide capacity for any kind of regional approach. First are regulatory resources, which provide the power to regulate private and public sector activities, and they vary in both scope and strength. So can a regional entity actually create and enforce regulations? Second are financial resources, or the capacity to raise funds needed to carry out regional activities. This might include taxes, borrowing, grants, or any combination of the 3, versus only relying on senior governments for their fiscal livelihoods. The third resource is political resources, or the power to make decisions and how decisions are made. For example, whether individuals are elected to a regional entity directly by local voters or appointed through other means. A fourth resource is professional resources, which include having the necessary staff, skills, and competencies to carry out regional activities without relying on other levels of government. And finally, planning resources, which provide the authority to develop a long-term policy agenda for the region. The presence and absence of these resources often explain the differences between regional approaches across the country and why some regional approaches fail and others succeed. Before I turn things back over to Craig, I think it's worth re-emphasizing that forces like COVID-19, climate change, population decline, and rapid technological innovation are too big to manage alone. I'd like to leave you with a story from Northern Ontario. When I was doing research on regional development, I asked one of the mayors why they had created a regional mayors coalition consisting of the mayors from the 5 largest municipalities. And his response really resonated with me. He said, if you took a pencil in your hand and you snapped it, it's easy. But if you put 5 pencils in your hand, you can't break that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heather. Fantastic presentation. My first question, though, and I'll start with you, Mr. Wells, if I can, and then I'll sort of move around the panel. It's sort of a big one. What's at stake here if we don't do this or if we don't do it properly?
Our economic and social development and other aspects of life in the province will not develop, will be retarded because there's no incentive, no inducement for people to get, not just incentive and inducement, and also no means, no convenient means. You've got to have that combination of the interests of local people in the regions and the means whereby they can, the medium through which they can put their focus, their efforts. And then they need, in order to really be successful, they need assistance or help. And one of the things we put in place with, you call the Red Bees, the regional economic boards, what we put in place for them was provincial support, financial support. And that once that was made known and people realized they weren't just another means of finding a way of taxing, of getting more tax revenue. Once that sunk in, then you started to get effort from the bottom up.
Right.
And the success of this comes with effort from the bottom up. You can't just impose that kind of activity and work.
Right.
You've got to focus, provide a means of attracting interest.
Sure. And I guess the support can take a lot of shapes. Even I know at the time the Red Bees had a lot of support in terms of analysis, economic analysis, and that sort of thing. So there is the financial side of it for sure, but there's the technical support as well.
You're quite correct. I mean, each individual regional economic zone board would not have the ability to do the analysis that would be needed, but the Economic Recovery Commission or Enterprise Newfoundland and Labrador did.
Right.
And they could be the support mechanism. And that's what they needed. But what they didn't need was the Economic Recovery Commission or the Department of Development of Government telling them this is what you're going to do and this is what you're not going to do. They've got to be involved and make the decisions.
Heather, from your perspective as an interested observer, as somebody who's worked here, somebody who has studied Newfoundland and Labrador, what do you think is at stake on the discussion around regional government or regional governance?
I think for some places, it's actually a matter of survival. I think in some instances, the capacity and the resources are so spread few and far between that not all communities, given the demographic realities we're facing, the economic trends we're seeing, and now this global pandemic, we're certainly up against these big, big challenges that will require some of our smallest communities to have to work together in order to ensure their survival so that they can share capacity, they can share resources, and they can share that expertise amongst themselves.
That's a really interesting point, because one of the things that comes up in discussions around what should be regionalized and that sort of thing is around scope. You know, environmental issues, for example, don't respect municipal boundaries. Economic development issues, labor markets don't respect municipal boundaries. You need a catchment area big enough to sort of manage all of that. But when we see things like economic shocks in 2008 and 9, when we see things like a pandemic, those are challenges of scale. They're so big that it's very difficult for a small individual municipality to deal with it.
In the Western world, OECD countries, Canada has the weakest local government of all the OECD countries. Newfoundland and Labrador has the weakest local government in Canada. So think global, act local. We have the least capacity to act at a local or regional level. And, you know, you could say, oh, regionalization, okay, that's one thing. There's no panaceas. And no, it's not a panacea. But it's not just one policy intervention. because we set up to organize life in government, departments in particular, areas of expertise and specialization. Universities do the same thing. And we constantly know that the real world doesn't respect our conceptual silos.
It comes back to, I think, thinking about regionalization, which is that more top-down process of the government or a senior government coming in and saying, we need to create regions for whatever purpose it might be. And then that more grassroots regionalism, which tends to be more organic and is about communities that are neighbors working together and sharing maybe a common identity over particular reasons, or sharing resources over whatever that might be: service delivery, waste management, environmental planning. And so I think part of it starts with trying to see where are some of those regions that already exist. So whether they're functional regions, whether they're labor market regions, whether they're regions that are connected because of commuting, whether it's for tourism purposes, and seeing if there's a way that you can build on top of that. So using some of those regional movements that we already see and trying to find ways to expand that out into other areas. So I think that's a really good starting point. I think from a government perspective, from a provincial government perspective, it requires a really well-coordinated plan on what you're hoping to do and why, so that you can articulate that to the citizens, you can articulate that to municipal governments, and show why it's so important to be thinking about regional approaches and why they're needed. And I think that's part of the challenge on the part of government, is to help show why it's so important. And that was one of the things that I think the commission did so well when the Red Bees were established, was that they had all of this evidence and they went out and they engaged and they heard from people in local communities and then built the strategy from there.
One of the very interesting things that Dr. Kelly Vaden found out in her research on that was that when you mapped out these functional regions, the most closely resembled, the existing entities that they most closely resembled were joint councils, which are voluntary municipal organizations. They have no authority, they have no power. It's simply mayors and councils deciding to get together to talk about regional issues. But really, the reason to do regional development is that you should do it. It is a better way to accomplish the things we want to accomplish in terms of economic development, environmental protection, sustainability. It's the better way to go about it. So with that in mind, Rob, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Heather, and I'll give the last word to Mr. Wells. What's our next step? What do we do next?
I think this is a good effort. I think the provincial government certainly has talked about regionalization, and MNL has been back and forth. There's a ton of research. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have loads of expertise within Memorial and with our colleagues elsewhere. We can learn from the Quebec model, the BC model, other places, but it has to be adapted to our context. I think we just really need the political will. And under the Canadian Constitution, municipal government is a creature of the provinces. So we need the provincial government to act. And paralysis by analysis is not the answer. Perfection is the enemy of the good. I can quote lots of cliches at you. Start.
Do something.
Do something.
Heather, what about from your view? What's our next
I agree.
step?
I think it's really up to the provincial government to say it's happening and this is why it's happening and here's what we hope is going to be the outcome. And then it's up to all of the great organizations like MNL and others on the ground to try and make that happen and bring together people on the ground and to shape that process. But I think I 100% agree with Rob that it starts with the provincial government.
Mr. Wells?
I share that view. It can only start with the provincial government in reality. But I caution against going in with too much and creating a system of regional government.
Right.
Let that develop over time as people willingly see the benefit of taking more and more responsibility themselves. And once they have control and responsibility for development, they'll be more willing to take responsibility for cost and let that flow. But if you go in with implementing a government structure from the beginning, you're going to get tremendous resistance.
Yep.
In a word, restore the regional economic zones and the board system and start with that as a basis and work from there.
Well, and if you give people a tool and that tool works, then they're more likely to start using it more broadly. If you
Exactly.
start with a function, form follows function. If we can have some wins, if we can put something together that works on a particular issue, then more people are willing to use that tool on other issues, and so it grows. Thanks very much to all three panelists. This has been a fantastic discussion, at least from my perspective. I hope you enjoyed it.
I did.
I hope our audience enjoyed it. I think this is actually a pretty important moment for us as an organization, as a province, and I hope we can act on some of the things we've heard here today. So, Mr. Wells, thank you so much for giving us your time and your thoughts today. Dr. Greenwood, as always, a pleasure. Thanks for your insights. Dr. Hall, it's a pleasure seeing you and hearing you from up along. It's been great seeing you again. Thanks for all your contributions to our discussion today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.